August 9th, 1898, Dover, Delaware. The air on that Tuesday was a heavy, wet blanket, the kind of oppressive summer heat that stills the leaves on the trees and makes the simple act of breathing a conscious effort. On the shaded porch of a handsome house on Division Street, the home of former state Congressman John P. Dunning, a scene of domestic tranquility was playing out against the stifling atmosphere. It was a picture of late Victorian respectability, a family gathered in the precious cool of the late afternoon. There was John's wife, Mary Elizabeth Dunning, a woman known for her quiet grace, and her sister, Ida Deane. With them were the children, their youthful energy muted by the humidity, their presence a soft counterpoint to the adult conversation. They were unaware of the object that had arrived earlier that day, an object that was, at that very moment, sitting inside the house. It was a small, unassuming package delivered by the United States mail, a testament to the modern miracle of cross-country correspondence. It had traveled over 3,000 miles, a journey from the bustling, sun-bleached streets of San Francisco to this quiet, established corner of the East Coast. None of them knew that death had already arrived, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. They did not know that their peaceful afternoon was the final chapter of a story whose violent beginning had been written weeks before, in a mind they could not possibly comprehend. The package was addressed to Mr. John P. Dunning, but it was Mary who brought it out onto the porch. Inside the plain wrapping was an elegant, pale blue box of candy from a popular confectioner, George Haas and Sons. It was tied with a delicate pink ribbon, a flourish that suggested a thoughtful, perhaps feminine sender. Accompanying the candy was a small handkerchief and a note. The note was simple, almost cryptic, bearing a single question. "Will you be my friend?" It was signed only with the name Mrs. C. Who was Mrs. C? The question hung in the humid air, a minor puzzle on an otherwise unremarkable day. The family speculated. Perhaps it was a relative, a forgotten acquaintance. The gesture seemed kind, a sweet and anonymous offering. In an era when social connections were a currency of their own, such a small mystery was a welcome diversion. Mary Dunning, a woman of gentle disposition, saw no malice in it. She saw only a box of bonbons, a treat to be shared. The children's eyes lit up at the sight of the sugary morsels. She untied the pink ribbon. Lifting the lid revealed rows of chocolates, neatly arranged. Mary took one. Her sister, Ida, took another. Two of the neighborhood children who had joined them on the porch were also offered a piece. The candy was passed around, a communal act of trust and simple pleasure. But the taste was wrong. A bitter, metallic flavor lingered on the tongue, a harshness that candy should never possess. It was chalky, unpleasant. Mary spat hers out, warning the others. But it was too late. For some, a single bite was all it would take. Within an hour, the first wave of sickness struck. It was violent and terrifyingly swift. It began with a burning in the throat, a fire that spread down into the stomach, followed by excruciating cramps that doubled the victims over in agony. Then came the relentless, violent retching. The porch, a place of serene family life just moments before, became a scene of chaos and suffering. Dr. T.C. Frame was summoned, arriving to a house in pandemonium. He found Mary Dunning and Ida Deane in the throes of a horrific illness, their bodies contorted in pain. The two children were also sick, though their symptoms were less severe. The doctor initially suspected cholera morbus, a common summer ailment with similar brutal symptoms. But as the hours wore on, the severity of the illness pointed to something far more sinister. The poison was working its way through their systems with methodical cruelty. Mary Dunning's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her sister Ida fought on, her body racked with convulsions. The house on Division Street once a symbol of quiet prosperity, had transformed into a makeshift hospital filled with the sounds of moaning and despair. By the next day, Wednesday, August 10th, Mary Elizabeth Dunning was dead. Her sister, Ida Deane, succumbed to the poison 2 days later, her life ending in the same agonizing fashion. The 2 children thankfully survived, having ingested only a small amount. The community of Dover was plunged into a state of shock and horror. This was not a disease. This was murder. The investigation began immediately, and its focus narrowed with chilling speed to that single, deadly object. The box of chocolates. It was the vessel, the weapon delivered with the unassuming reliability of the United States Postal Service. The remaining candies were sent for chemical analysis. The verdict came back, confirming the town's worst fears. They were laced with a massive quantity of arsenic. The seemingly innocent gift was, in fact, a sophisticated and diabolical instrument of death, designed to kill not just one person, but anyone who partook. It was an act of indiscriminate slaughter, hidden beneath a veneer of sweetness. The central question was no longer what had killed them, but who? Who was Mrs. C? Who harbored a hatred so profound that they would send poison across an entire continent? The search for an answer would lead investigators away from the genteel society of Delaware and into the complex, transient world of San Francisco, into the heart of a toxic love triangle and the mind of a woman whose public facade concealed a universe of obsession and rage. Her name was Cordelia Botkin. To understand the crime, we must first understand the woman at its center. Cordelia Botkin was not, by the standards of the day, a monster in plain sight. She presented a picture of middle-class respectability. She was married to a man named Welcome A. Botkin, a grain broker of some means. She was known in her social circles as a woman of charm and intelligence, with a magnetic personality. But beneath this polished surface lay a life of profound dissatisfaction and emotional turmoil. Her marriage was a hollow arrangement, a partnership in name only. She and her husband lived largely separate lives, and Cordelia craved a passion and a connection that her conventional existence did not provide. She was a woman of contradictions. Her background was not one of privilege. She had known hardship and had climbed the social ladder with a quiet determination. This climb gave her an acute awareness of social standing and the precariousness of a woman's position in the late 19th century. Her identity, her security, was tied to the men in her life. First her father, then her husband. This dependence fostered a deep-seated anxiety, a fear of being abandoned or cast aside. She was intelligent and ambitious, but the outlets for a woman of her era were severely limited. Society expected her to be a wife and a mother, a keeper of the home. It did not have a place for a woman of her powerful and ultimately destructive passions. Her life changed irrevocably in 1895. It was then that she met John P. Dunning, the very man to whom the poisoned candy would be addressed. Dunning was in San Francisco covering the Midwinter Fair as a correspondent for the Associated Press. He was a married man, a respected figure from a prominent Delaware family, but he was also a man susceptible to temptation. He was estranged from his wife, Mary, living separately from her and their daughter. He was lonely, and in Cordelia Botkin, he found a kindred spirit. Or so he thought. Their connection was immediate and intense. Cordelia was everything his wife in Delaware was not. She was vivacious, worldly, and intellectually engaging. She moved in bohemian circles, a world away from the staid society of Dover. For Dunning, she was an escape. For Cordelia, he was an obsession. He became the singular focus of her life, the vessel into which she poured all her frustrated ambitions and her desperate need for love and validation. Their affair was not a secret, at least not in the circles they frequented in San Francisco. They were seen together constantly, living as if they were man and wife. Cordelia became, in her own mind, the true Mrs. Dunning. This carefully constructed reality, however, was built on a foundation of lies and self-deception. John Dunning, for all his affection for Cordelia, was still legally and emotionally tied to his family back east. He corresponded regularly with his wife, Mary, and his daughter. This correspondence became a source of immense jealousy and insecurity for Cordelia. Every letter that arrived from Delaware was a reminder of her precarious position, a testament to the fact that she was the other woman, not the wife. The home that John Dunning had in Dover was a place she could never enter, and the woman who presided over it, Mary Dunning, became the focus of a slow-burning, pathological hatred. Cordelia began to employ a strategy of astonishing psychological cruelty. She started writing anonymous letters to Mary Dunning in Delaware. These were not simple threats. They were insidious, designed to inflict the maximum amount of emotional pain. She would inform Mary of her husband's infidelities in graphic detail, taunting her with information that only an intimate partner could know. She reveled in describing the life John and she shared in California, painting a picture of domestic bliss that was a twisted mirror of the family life Mary was trying to maintain. One letter chillingly warned Mary that her husband might try to poison her. It was a projection of her own dark thoughts, a way of testing the waters of her own murderous imagination. Then, in a move of breathtaking audacity, Cordelia changed tactics. She began writing to Mary under her own name, but this time she posed as a friend. She presented herself as a concerned acquaintance of John's, a woman who wanted to help Mary understand her husband better. She offered sympathy and advice, creating a false intimacy that was grotesque in its deception. She was playing a long, cruel game, weaving a web of lies that drew her closer to the woman she despised. Mary, isolated and confused in Delaware, seemed to have cautiously accepted this strange correspondence, perhaps desperate for any insight into her husband's distant life. Through this feigned friendship, Cordelia learned more about the family, about their routines, their lives, their vulnerabilities. She was gathering intelligence. The situation came to a head in the spring of 1898. John Dunning was recalled to Washington for his work with the Associated Press. The Spanish-American War had broken out, and he was needed on the East Coast. For Cordelia, this was a catastrophe. The center of her universe was being torn away from her. She pleaded with him to stay, but his professional obligations were absolute. Before he left, he made a decision that would seal his wife's fate. He reconciled with Mary. He returned not just to the East Coast, but to his family, leaving Cordelia alone in San Francisco with her obsession and her rage. Abandonment was Cordelia Botkin's greatest fear, and now it was her reality. The life she had built for herself had crumbled. In her mind, there was only one person to blame: Mary Dunning. The quiet, respectable wife in Delaware had won. She had reclaimed her husband, leaving Cordelia with nothing. It was in the crucible of this rejection that the plan began to form. She would not accept defeat. If she could not have John Dunning, then no one would. The anonymous letters had been a form of psychological warfare. Now she would escalate to a physical assault. It would be an attack from a distance, a perfect crime that would allow her to strike from across the continent, her hands remaining clean. The investigation in Dover quickly turned its attention to John Dunning. Upon learning of the anonymous note signed Mrs. C, he knew instantly. The blood drained from his face. He knew who had sent the package. He told the authorities about his affair in San Francisco, about the magnetic but volatile woman named Cordelia Botkin. He provided them with the letters she had sent him and the ones she had deviously sent to his wife. A portrait began to emerge of a woman scorned, a woman with a powerful motive for revenge. The focus of the investigation shifted 3,000 miles west to the city of San Francisco. Inspector Isaiah W. Lees, a legendary figure in California law enforcement, was tasked with the case. He began to meticulously retrace Cordelia Botkin's steps in the days leading up to the mailing of the package. The case against her would be built not on a single piece of damning evidence, but on a chain of circumstantial links, each one forged in the mundane transactions of daily life. The first link was the candy itself. Investigators visited the upscale confectioner, George Haas and Sons, on Market Street. A clerk, a young man named Joseph Newhouse, was questioned. Did he remember a woman purchasing a box of assorted chocolates around the end of July? He did. He remembered her clearly. He described a well-dressed, confident woman who had come into the shop and made the purchase. When shown a photograph of Cordelia Botkin, he identified her without hesitation. She had bought the box of candy. The second link was the poison. Where did the arsenic come from? This was a more difficult trail to follow. Arsenic was a common substance in the 19th century, readily available for purchase at pharmacies, for use as a rat poison, or in other household applications. It was shockingly easy to acquire. Inspector Lees and his men began a systematic canvass of drugstores in the vicinity of Cordelia's home. At the Owl drugstore, they found their man. A druggist named John B. Levington recalled selling a small quantity of arsenic to a woman who matched Cordelia's description. She had signed the poison register as required by law, but had used a false name. Mrs. C.P. Crocker. The name itself was a small act of defiant arrogance, borrowing the surname of one of San Francisco's most powerful families. The signature, however, would prove to be a crucial piece of evidence. The third and most powerful link was the handwriting. The investigators had the note sent with the candy. "Will you be my friend?" They had the mailing label from the package. They also had the trove of letters Cordelia had sent to both John and Mary Dunning. They submitted all of these documents to a leading handwriting expert of the day, Theodore Kitka. He spent days poring over the documents, comparing the loops of the L's, the slant of the T's, the unique flourishes of each character. His conclusion was unequivocal. The handwriting on the mailing label, the note in the candy box, and the signature in the poison register were all written by the same person who had penned the letters to the Dunnings. They were all written by Cordelia Botkin. The chain of evidence was becoming unbreakable. She had the motive, jealousy, and revenge. She had the means. She had purchased both the candy and the arsenic. She had the opportunity. She was in San Francisco when the package was mailed. The investigators pieced together a timeline. On July 31st, 1898, Cordelia Botkin purchased the arsenic. On August 1st, she bought the box of chocolates. She would have then undertaken the grim task of preparing her weapon, carefully injecting or dusting the individual pieces of candy with the lethal white powder. On August 4th, the package was mailed from a post office near her home. On September 12th, 1898, Inspector Lees and another officer went to Cordelia Botkin's residence. They found her there, calm and composed. When they informed her that she was being arrested for the murders of Mary Dunning and Ida Deane, her reaction was not one of shock or hysteria. It was one of cool, almost theatrical, defiance. She denied everything. She claimed to know nothing about any candy, any poison. She maintained that she was a wronged woman, the true victim in this affair, abandoned by her lover, and now being framed for a crime she did not commit. Her performance was convincing, but the evidence told a different story. The arrest of Cordelia Botkin and the details of the crime created a media sensation. Newspapers across the country ran lurid headlines about the candy poisoner. The case had all the elements of a Victorian melodrama, a passionate affair, a spurned lover, a respectable family destroyed, and a murder weapon that was both feminine and diabolical. Cordelia became a national figure. Her photograph splashed across the front pages. She was portrayed as a modern-day Lucretia Borgia. a calculating and cold-blooded killer who used a gift of affection as an instrument of death. The public was captivated and horrified in equal measure. The trial of Cordelia Botkin, which began in December 1898, was a spectacle. The San Francisco courtroom was packed every day with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the enigmatic woman at the center of the scandal. She sat at the defense table, always impeccably dressed, her expression a carefully controlled mask of composure. She appeared to be the very model of a respectable lady, a stark contrast to the monstrous acts of which she stood accused. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Marshall B. Woodworth, laid out its case with methodical precision. They presented the chain of circumstantial evidence that Inspector Lees had so painstakingly assembled. The candy store clerk took the stand, pointing directly at Cordelia as the woman who bought the chocolates. The druggist testified about the sale of arsenic to a woman using a false name. And most importantly, the handwriting expert, Theodore Kitka, presented his findings in meticulous detail, demonstrating to the jury the undeniable similarities between Cordelia's known handwriting and the writing on the crucial pieces of evidence. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case, however, was the reading of Cordelia's letters. They were read aloud in the silent courtroom, her own words echoing back to condemn her. The anonymous letters to Mary Dunning were particularly damning, dripping with malice and a chilling prescience. The jury heard the taunts, the threats, the detailed accounts of her affair with John Dunning. The letters painted a portrait of a woman consumed by jealousy, a woman capable of extraordinary cruelty. They were a window into her mind, revealing a motive that was as powerful as any poison. The defense, led by attorney George A. Knight, faced an uphill battle. They could not dispute that Cordelia had had an affair with Dunning, nor could they easily refute the testimony of the clerks. Their strategy was therefore twofold. First, they attacked the credibility of the evidence. They argued that circumstantial evidence was not enough to convict. They brought in their own handwriting experts to challenge Kitka's testimony, arguing that handwriting analysis was not an exact science and could not be trusted to send a woman to the gallows. They attempted to portray Cordelia not as a killer, but as a heartbroken woman who had been cruelly used and discarded by John Dunning. They tried to shift the blame, suggesting Dunning himself might have had a motive. Their second and far more novel argument was a direct challenge to the court's authority. This was the legal masterstroke of the case. Knight argued that the court in San Francisco had no jurisdiction to try Cordelia Botkin for murder. The crime, he contended, had not occurred in California. The poison was mixed and mailed in California, yes. But the act of murder, the ingestion of the poison, and the subsequent deaths took place in Delaware. According to the law, as it was then understood, a murder was committed where the fatal blow was struck. In this case, the fatal blow landed 3,000 miles away. How could California prosecute a crime that was completed in another state? This argument was unprecedented. The law had not yet caught up to the technology of the mail. The idea of committing murder by remote control across state lines was a legal gray area that had never been tested in this way. The question resonated through the legal community. It was a brilliant, if cynical, defense. It sought to absolve Cordelia not by proving her innocence, but by exploiting a loophole in the fabric of American jurisprudence. The judge, however, ultimately rejected this argument, ruling that the trial could proceed. The question of jurisdiction would linger, becoming the basis for future appeals. But for now, Cordelia's fate rested in the hands of the 12 men on the jury. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 4 hours. The courtroom was tense as they filed back in. Cordelia Botkin stood to hear her fate, her composure finally showing cracks, her face pale. The foreman handed the verdict to the clerk. Guilty. guilty of the murder of Mary Dunning. She was sentenced to life in prison. She collapsed upon hearing the sentence, her carefully maintained facade shattering at last. But the legal battle was far from over. Her lawyers immediately began the appeals process, seizing upon the jurisdictional issue. The case went all the way to the California Supreme Court. In a landmark decision, the court upheld the defense's argument. They ruled that since the victims had died in Delaware, the state of California did not have jurisdiction to try the case for murder. Cordelia Botkin's conviction was overturned. For a moment, it seemed as though she might walk free, a killer acquitted on a technicality. The prosecution, however, was not finished. They had anticipated this possibility. While the appeal was pending, the California legislature had passed a new law specifically designed to close the loophole that Cordelia's case had exposed. The new statute, Penal Code Section 778, explicitly stated that a person could be tried in California for a crime if they had committed any part of that crime within the state, even if the final result occurred elsewhere. Armed with this new law, the district attorney decided to try her again. Cordelia Botkin's second trial began in 1904. It was largely a repeat of the first, with the same evidence and the same witnesses. But this time, the jurisdictional defense was off the table. The prosecution once again read her letters, once again had the clerks identify her, once again presented the damning handwriting analysis. The defense tried to argue that the new law could not be applied retroactively, but their arguments fell on deaf ears. The outcome was the same. Once again, the jury found her guilty. Once again, she was sentenced to life in San Quentin prison. This time, there would be no escape. Cordelia Botkin entered San Quentin as inmate number 19,418. Her life as a society woman, a passionate lover, a free citizen, was over. She would spend the rest of her days behind the stone walls of the prison. The vibrant, manipulative woman who had commanded the attention of an entire nation faded into the anonymity of the penal system. The other figures in this tragedy met their own quiet ends. John P. Dunning, the man at the center of the affair, was a broken figure. His life had been destroyed by the scandal. He was publicly shamed, his reputation in tatters. He had lost his wife, his sister-in-law, and his career. He lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity. A man forever haunted by his own indiscretions and the terrible price others had paid for them. He died in 1907, never fully recovering from the ordeal. Cordelia's time in prison was marked by a strange turn of events. In 1906, the Great San Francisco earthquake struck. San Quentin was damaged, and in the chaos, there were rumors that Cordelia had been killed. Some newspapers even reported her death. But she had survived. She was transferred for a time to Folsom Prison before being returned to San Quentin. Her health, however, began to fail. Years of confinement took their toll. She reportedly suffered from what was described as softening of the brain, a vague diagnosis that likely pointed to a decline into dementia or another neurological condition. The fiery intelligence and cunning that had defined her seemed to extinguish slowly in the dim light of her cell. She died in San Quentin on March 7th, 1910, at the age of 56. She never confessed to the murders. She never expressed remorse. To the very end, she maintained her innocence, clinging to the role of the victim. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds, her story ending not with a bang, but with a quiet, anonymous burial. The case of Cordelia Botkin left a lasting legacy. Legally, it was a landmark case that forced the American justice system to adapt to a new kind of crime. The legal principle established in its wake that a state has jurisdiction to prosecute a crime that begins within its borders, regardless of where it ends, remains a cornerstone of modern law. It was a direct response to her act, a recognition that technology had changed the very nature of violence, allowing it to transcend geography. In a way, she was a pioneer of a new, impersonal form of murder. But the case's deeper resonance lies in the questions it leaves behind, questions that linger long after the legal arguments have faded. It is a story about the dark side of human passion, about how love can curdle into an obsession so toxic it seeks not to possess, but to destroy. It is a story about the power of the written word, how letters meant to convey affection or information can be weaponized, turned into instruments of psychological torture and ultimately death. And at the heart of it all is the enigmatic figure of Cordelia Botkin herself. Was she a cold, calculating psychopath who planned her crime with meticulous, unfeeling precision? Or was she a woman driven to a state of temporary madness by heartbreak and abandonment, lashing out in a single, horrific act of passion? Her composure during the trial suggests a chilling degree of control, yet the frantic, emotional tone of her letters suggests a mind teetering on the edge of reason. She was both intelligent and irrational, both charming and monstrous. The mundane object at the center of this story, that simple box of chocolates, is what makes the crime so uniquely unsettling. It represents the ultimate betrayal of trust. A gift, a symbol of friendship or affection, was transformed into a vessel of death. The pink ribbon, a touch of delicate feminine grace, becomes a marker of profound cruelty. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with a monstrous face. Sometimes it arrives in a pretty box, offering a gesture of kindness. It speaks to a timeless, chilling truth that the greatest dangers can be hidden in the most ordinary of things, and that behind a mask of respectability can lie a heart capable of unimaginable darkness. Was Cordelia Botkin a product of her time, a woman whose intelligence and passion found no healthy outlet in a restrictive society, leading them to fester into a murderous rage? Or was she simply a malevolent soul who would have been a predator in any era? The evidence convicts her in a court of law, but the mystery of her true nature remains locked away, as silent as her unmarked grave. What do you think? Drop your verdict in the comments below.